Hi, I'm Ana Gomes. I'm a labor law professor at the University of Fortaleza, Brazil.
And I'm Anil Verma, a professor at the University of Toronto and a co-author of this study. We are very happy to share the findings of our study of waste pickers in Brazil.
So our paper studies waste pickers, one of the most vulnerable, excluded, and informal group of workers, even though they perform a green type of work. We did this research because we wanted to see how their life and work could be improved and how labor law could be more inclusive of these types of work. We will present here some photos that we took during our empirical research. So this is one of the associations we have visited. We interviewed the waste pickers in this association. Most of them are women who used to work on agriculture, had no income, and we also interviewed public municipal authorities. In Brazil, and this is what has motivated our research, their work is very, very important. For you to have an idea, less than 4% of the recyclable waste in Brazil is ever recyclable. And of this amount, 90% is collected by waste pickers. So they are the main environmental agent in Brazil if you consider the question of waste. But they work in this profound informality. They manually collect, separate waste, and they treat the waste and send this waste for recycle. But how do they work? They work mainly in two ways: in individual or small groups, on the streets or in dump sites, or they work collectively organized in associations or cooperatives. Around 10% of them work in these associations or cooperatives. Our primary focus on our research is the waste pickers associations. But later in the paper, as you have read, we compare selected outcomes for individual non-associated waste pickers and others who work within waste pickers associations. And of course, we try to answer the question of how collective organization has an impact in the improvement of working conditions of these informal workers. And even though we're talking about waste pickers in Brazil, our research relates to the majority of the workforce in the world that is in the informal economy, but especially for those informal workers who were, of course, affected by globalization and technological change, but that have been informal for a long time. Some of them have never been included by labor law. The working conditions of waste pickers threat their lives, their health, their safety, and their dignity. When they work unorganized on the streets or on dump sites, they pull carts facing uphills and downhills on urban streets, exposing themselves to car accidents, to harassment, to violence. Sometimes they pull more than 100 kilos of waste, and their activity causes physical and psychological problems. Most of them who work unorganized do not use any type of safety equipment like gloves or masks or boots. They work long hours without breaks. And as I said, they expose to harassment and violence, especially from public authorities who do not see their activity as work. And what we have seen during our research is that labor law does not have a lot of answers to the challenge faced by these workers.
Okay, we already spoke to this. Okay, let's briefly examine our findings. We looked at the inputs, the process, and the outcomes of these associations. Almost all the associations needed some kind of seed funding to get started, either from the government, some level of government, or from an NGO that could be an international NGO or a local NGO. And in one case, some assistance from a local university. They also needed access to waste. In many cases, they do not have access to the waste that's produced in the city because it is collected by trucks and taken to a dump site. In terms of their work, the biggest challenge they face is the issue of legitimacy, because they face the social stigma of being seen as scavengers, thieves, and undesirable characters that we should avoid. They are poorly educated, so they don't have the skills that are needed for efficient and sustainable organization. And in terms of outcomes, I will review the conditions briefly. They are better when they work in associations, but they also lack the market power and the protection of the law to be able to perform their work. Now let's look at the outcomes for waste pickers who worked within an association, and we compare them with individual waste pickers who were not part of an association but worked the streets on their own. Definitely the working conditions were better for workers in the associations. They had some safety equipment, they had some level of mechanization in their sorting centers with use of conveyor belts, compactors, loading and unloading docks. They generally earned better wages and had better benefits. Their work was steady. They worked in self-managing teams. And although they had no unions, no trade unions, they functioned very much like a small worker cooperative.
Well, for labor law, our central argument was that labor law must be more inclusive than it has been in the past. In particular, should try to include these informal self-employed workers. Waste pickers are not in a gray zone between self-employment and employment relationship. They are self-employed workers. So the question for regulation is how to guarantee fundamental rights for these workers. And we have seen how some of these rights are essential and very effective. For example, collective organization and collective bargaining. The work pickers who are able to associate or work together in co-ops, they improve better, they have better working conditions. They use safety equipment, they have breaks during their working hours, they are able to have some basic remuneration. Of course, we have seen also that labor regulation is not enough, especially in the case of these, what we call old informals. They face different challenges, sometimes housing, access to health, and even fooding. So labor law must coordinate with other types of policies and regulations to be able to reach the problems that they have to face. So these are some of the associations we have visited.
So looking beyond the law, our view is that a problem as complex as informal work cannot be addressed by law alone. So here, the changes in law need to have some support of changes in institutions. Number one that stood out for us is the role of the municipal government. Unless the municipal government is committed to inclusiveness, to fair and decent working conditions for waste pickers, it is very hard to make this arrangement work. Local governments also need to coordinate with and reach out to community groups that often have better contacts with these workers than a formal government would. Community groups also need to combine environmental education of the citizens along with their work, because these workers are going to every household, so they can educate people on how to sort waste properly and how to collect it. And lastly, collective organization appears to be the most efficient way to improve their conditions in addition to the law. Let us end by asking the question how this experience can help other groups of informal workers who are indeed the majority of the global workforce. Roughly 2/3 of all workers in the developing countries are informal, and about 60% of all workers in the world are informal. So here we should ask the question of how to create the value chain in labor rights. Normally, when workers work for an identifiable employer, the way it begins is that workers acquire voice through organizing themselves, making their organization sustainable, then acquiring rights for bargaining under the law, and then attaining and enforcing those rights under the law. For informal workers, this takes a different form, or it should take a different form. That is, they acquire voice by representing their interests to whoever is holding the other side of their interests. It can be the employer, it can be the government, it can be business, it can be households. And their access to decent work. They form organizations which don't look like trade unions, but they're more like co-ops, associations, and NGOs. They become sustainable if they can have access to managerial and professional knowledge, and they have access to financial support through seed funding. They also need a fair price for their resorted recyclables. Then they acquire consultation and bargaining rights under the law with a variety of stakeholders, not just an identifiable employer. And lastly, they would need to have enforceable contracts for access to inputs, which is the trash, and access to the markets where they can sell their trash. So perhaps this experience would help other groups of informal workers.
So in the way of a conclusion, we want to give a message that even though labor law has not been very inclusive of all types of workers, our research was able to show that it can be. And the way is to develop paths to reach those informal workers, acting strategically with different types of policies and regulations, and trying to adapt or create new tools that are compatible with the conditions of life and work of informal workers.
We hope that the lessons learned from this study of waste pickers in Brazil can be generalized to help other groups of informal workers around the world who are indeed the majority of all workers. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you.